So, moving on to our next wonderful speaker. As I said, it's very important that the degrowth discourse is open to different perspectives. Federico De Maria said in the opening evening something very important. We should not think of degrowth as a new model to export all over the world, just as we have exported development. So it's very important to listen to other voices and other perspectives. And this is something that we have been doing in these days and we are doing in this conference. And this is why it's so important that Sunita Narain accepted to join us to this conference. She would have come to the conference, but unfortunately she couldn't, but she will be live streamed per Skype and give us a talk. Sunita Narain is an Indian environmentalist and political activist, as well as a major proponent of the green concept of sustainable development. Narain has been with the India-based Center for Science and Environment since 1982. She's currently the director of the center and the director of the Society for Environmental Communications and publisher of the fortnightly magazine Down to Earth. She will give us a speech with this title, A Right to Grow, Meeting the Needs of All Within the Planetary Boundaries. So help me welcoming very warmly, because she's far away, Sunita Narain.
Barbara, do you want me to begin? Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. I'm very happy to be with you and very happy that I am in Delhi, where it has rained this morning, and we've had a really bad monsoon with drought all around, and so today is a good day for us as well. So I'm delighted to be with you in Leipzig, and I look forward to talking today to explain some of our concerns. The key issue for us, and I think the conference, in my view, has framed the right question finally. We began talking about environment and development as way back as 1992, when the buzzword was sustainable development. And by the time the world reached the Rio conference once again in 2012, we were talking about a green economy. But in both cases of sustainable development or the green economy, in my view, the world did not frame the right question. And the question is what you are asking today, which is, do we have the right to grow? How do we meet the needs of all within the planetary boundaries? And that, to me, is the core issue as we move ahead. We need to find a way that world can grow economically to meet the needs, the aspirations of the poorest in the world. We need to find a way that we can share the resources of the world with all. And we also need to do all this making sure that we can live within the planetary boundaries. And that is the challenge. That is the core of the environmental issue. And this is when we know today that we are faced with a warming world. We know that the fact is that all our mitigation efforts till now are turning out to be too little, too late. The future is not far. The future, in fact, is here. In India, we are experiencing more and more extreme weather events. We're getting more hailstorms, more variable cold, more heat events, and we are beginning to see more extreme rainfall events. Now, you must understand that in a country like India, where the real finance minister is actually the monsoon, our rain season, then a more extreme monsoon means huge impacts on the livelihoods of the very poor in the country. And this is really the bitterest of the ironies that we face, that the poor in the world who are least responsible for climate change are its worst victims. And this is unacceptable. This has to be unacceptable, not only to you and me who are sitting in this one big hall, but to the world around us. And the question has to be, how do we move ahead? And so what I will try and do today, this morning, is to discuss with you the two realities that I see. The big opportunity that we must grasp at this moment, and also the big course correction that we must bring in the environmental movement of the world, so that we can actually find a way to have a secure future for all. We need inclusive growth. We need to make sure that that growth reaches the poorest of the world. So the first reality is that we must accept that climate change is not just about cutting emissions that are linked to growth. Climate change is about sharing growth between people and between nations. And this makes it really tough in an intensely unequal world. It is no surprise then that the world is still struggling with this reality. In 1992, the Framework Convention on Climate Change had accepted the fact that the rich world will reduce its emissions and make space for the poor to grow. I keep calling it that was the age of innocence. That was the age when we all believed that the world was just and fair, that the rich would reduce their emissions so that the poor could grow, and that we would all reinvent the way that we would do development so that we would all be able to share live within the planetary boundaries. That was 1992. But today, that same situation is even more difficult. It is even more contested. In 1992, there was only a very small group of countries who were claimants of the global atmospheric space. Now there are many more. In 1992, industrialized countries accounted for 70% of the annual emissions. Today, they account for 40% of the annual emissions. But the problem is that the rich did not reduce and make space. The rest of the countries have grown and added emissions to an already heated world. And this is why we are running out of space, we are running out of time. And this is even more complicated because climate change is not just about the problem of present, but of past contribution, of the gases that have already been emitted, but which are a source of the crisis today, what we call the historical contribution. And this is why the world, in some senses, in spite of all the talk, in spite of all the times the world leaders have come together to say that they will do something on climate change. And this is when the science is clear, more than ever, that action is imperative. We still find that we are doing too little and too late. But the reality, and this is the reality that I began to talk about, the reality is that we need an effective and an ambitious agreement, but an effective and ambitious agreement can only be possible if it is a fair agreement. It is in everybody's interest to build a collaborative agreement, because if the rich emitted yesterday, the poor will do so tomorrow. So it is about building a cooperative agreement which is built on fairness, which is built on equity. And this has to be the basis of our discussions. We have to recognize that without an agreement which is first fair and equitous, we will not be able to have an ambitious agreement on climate change. The second reality is that the world cannot cut emissions until we discuss seriously the options of what your conference is contemplating, degrowth. We need those options on the table we need to know how we can actually build economic futures without destroying the earth. We need this because we know that mitigation today is not adding up. Science is clear, action is not. We know today that we are on a pathway of at least 3 degrees, if not more, of centigrade of temperature rise. And we need to make sure that we can take very aggressive action to reduce emissions, which basically means that we need trajectories that are transformational. We cannot afford to have transitional trajectories of emission reduction anymore. And the reason is that the world has a double challenge. We need to reduce emissions, but on the other hand, we also need to increase emission to meet the needs of all. Which is why, as I said, the world needs the transformational technologies and no longer the transitional technologies. So those are really our 2 realities. The inability of the world to move ahead on climate change until it has a fair agreement, an equitous agreement. And 2, the imperative that we need to find ways of having transformational change, not just transitional change. Those are the realities. But there is also an opportunity. The opportunity is for us to really understand once for all that the current way of development, which is resource extractive, which is capital intensive, and so is highly iniquitous and highly polluting, will need to be reinvented. We need to be able to frame our questions today to say, how do we meet the needs of all and yet stay within planetary boundaries? If we combine the issues of justice and equity with the imperative of sustainability, we can find the new answers. That is the opportunity. Take India, and I'll give you 2 examples from India which will help you to understand the challenge that we are facing. One, if you look at India, we are relatively poor, yet we are fast developing. How can we get it right? How can a country like India reinvent growth without pollution? How can we change our trajectory of development so that we can give well-being to millions of our people, energy to all, and yet not add to greenhouse gas emissions from coal burning? How can we have mobility to all and yet not add to local or global emissions? Is that at all possible? And when I say this, you must also understand the scale of the challenge that we are faced with in India. India's population, as you know, is over 1 billion. We still have to reach energy for basic needs to millions of people. 30% of people use kerosene for lighting. 700 million people use firewood for cooking. So the scale of our energy need is massive. We need to increase our energy generation. We have to find a way to meet the needs of all. The question we have is, can we do this differently? Can we do something that the world has not? And to answer this, really, we need to reframe the question by asking, can we reach energy to all, but can it be clean energy to all? Is that possible? It is possible if India and the rest of the world was to actually rethink the question. Today we talk about clean energy as a goal in itself. We talk about clean energy and we think about renewable energy, and we think that if we can get solar energy, we have met the ultimate goal in the world. But in my view, solar energy is a half answer. It is not even an answer if we cannot combine clean energy with the question about energy access for all. If you do solar for solar, then we in India will do what large parts of the world have been doing, not Germany, but many other parts have been doing, which is to build renewable energy and then feed it all to a grid. So build large solar plants, like large fossil fuel plants, and then connect it all to grid systems. But this means that the people who already have energy also get access to a clean source of energy. The question that we should be asking is that can we do renewable energy, clean energy to meet the needs of all? Because even now when countries are talking about renewables or talking about moving out of coal, at best they are moving into gas. And they're moving into gas, countries like the US, because they have suddenly discovered large amounts of shale gas, and so it is convenient for them to be green. They are not looking at shale gas or gas as meeting the ultimate objective, which is to meet the needs of all in the world. So if the question then is reframed to become clean energy for energy access, then you have to think about the answer differently as well. In vast parts of the world, the grid has reached, but supply is unreliable. In some parts, there is no grid at all. So the question then becomes, can we use solar energy in a decentralized way through mini grids so that people in rural areas, poor people, can actually get first access to clean sources of energy rather than energy which is fossil fuel based, which comes to them through a large grid. And that completely changes the paradigm of growth. You start looking at energy as an enabler. You start looking at clean energy as a way to bring the transformation that we are talking about, that we so desperately need in the world. But when we start doing this, we also have to be clear that this is not cheap. It is not going to be easy. The plan in India is to create such a framework, to use a feed-in tariff to pay the differential between this energy, which is a decentralized form of energy generated through mini grids, and the grid-based energy source, which is fossil fuel-based and is still cheaper. But the problem is that there are very few business models to reach the poorest in the world. We know how to build a large power plant, a large nuclear plant, a large solar plant, and connect those plants to people who are connected to the market, people who can pay for energy. The transformation we require is to make sure that this relatively more expensive form of energy reaches and meets the needs of the poorest in the world, the most marginalized in the world, and that this can happen with quality and affordable service. Now, this is where the world needs to think out of the box. We need to think of a global agreement which is based on rights, which makes tough emission reductions a condition in the rich world, but also links it to a global feed-in tariff regime so that you can actually do the same as we are thinking in India across the world. Make sure that we can link clean energy to the needs of the poorest in the world. Make sure that we can actually feed and pay the differential between a cheap source of energy, a relatively more expensive source of energy, a cheaper way to supply energy through the grid, a more expensive way to supply energy through mini grids, through decentralized energy. Do that through a feed-in tariff, a global feed-in tariff regime, reach millions and billions across the world. Make the transformation that the world so desperately requires. That, in my view, is what degrowth is about. It is not degrowth, it is growth with a human face, growth with a difference. The second example, let me give you, is one of mobility. We know today that the world is still addicted to its cars. That at most that we talk about dealing with cars and the pollution of cars, we are talking about hybrid cars, we are talking about biofuel cars. But that doesn't deal with the crisis that the large numbers of vehicles are creating on our roads. The fact is that cars today add to local air pollution. They're also responsible for global air pollution, for climate change. And that all countries of the world, including Germany, are behind the problem. Every time you think you have fixed one pollutant, there is another pollution that you have to deal with, and you have to invest more money in dealing with it. And all this time, the cars in the world are actually adding to this massive, massive pollution challenge that we have. And we know that the answer really is to reinvent mobility so that we can move people and not cars. The question is, how will this happen? In my own city of Delhi, we are exploding with cars. And yet we know that the people who use cars are still a small majority. Less than 15% of Delhi still drives a car. Yet we have pollution, we have congestion. Most of Delhi still takes a bicycle or takes a bus. Not because it is rich, but because it is poor. And the question for us is, how can we become rich and yet take a bus or yet take a bicycle? And this is a difficult question. Please let us not underestimate it. The fact is that the cards are stacked against us. There are no role models for us to emulate. There is big corporate interest which is pushing for a car-centric model. Current economic thinking tells us that the more we consume, the better we are. So whether it is aspiration, whether it is needs, whether it is corporate greed or economic thinking, all converge together to make the world absolutely secure within its car-centric model. At most where countries have invested in public transport, it is always an afterthought. It is after the cars have been manufactured, they have been bought, they have been sold. It is not at the core of thinking. That is the problem with this toxic growth model that we have today. And so everything in that sense works against reinvention. Everything drives us to drive more, use more resources, emit, and then clean up. And the question that we have is, what can we do so that we do not first pollute and then clean up? I believe that the answers are there. In my own city, what we are saying is that we will have to reinvent because we cannot provide mobility to all. The fact is, as I said earlier, if only 15% of Delhi drives and already 26% of Delhi's roads Delhi's land area is under roads, we just do not have the roads to be able to meet the needs of all. So if we want mobility for all, we will have to reinvent the model. This is really the challenge at the global level as well. We do not have the space to meet the needs of all in the current growth economic model that we have adopted. So we have to reinvent, we have to think differently, we have to drastically change so that we can change the way we do mobility. In this case, we put it at the center of our thinking. So in this case, we have to think about sharing road space based on equity, based on the fact who uses most road space gets the largest share. And that has to be the global model even when it comes to climate change. Let me then discuss with you my final 2 points, which are about course correction. As I said, if we want all this, if we accept the reality, we know the opportunity, we will have to make certain changes in the way we do environmentalism in the world so that we can actually make this happen. What are those course corrections? Firstly, we have to understand and make a difference between the environmentalism of the poor versus the environmentalism of the rich. In the environmentalism of the rich, which is where Germany is and large parts of my country, the urban middle class are, we deal with environmental issues after we become rich. We look at them as a fallout of wealth accumulation and wealth creation. So the problem of toxic air or the problem of garbage is about cleaning up after we have generated it. This is the environmentalism of the rich, where we keep investing in technology to deal with the present, and which is why I keep saying that in the environmentalism of the rich or the middle class, we are garbage managers and nothing more. But in the environmentalism of the poor, there is a very different situation. In the environmentalism of the poor is what we in India are witnessing today. We have many protests today happening against pollution, against deforestation, against the takeover of grazing lands, fishing areas, beaches. These are protests not by the rich, but by the poor in my country. And these people are protesting not because environment is a luxury for them, but it is about survival. They are saying that the development that will come will make them even poorer. It will take away their livelihoods, it will destroy their life, it will add to pollution. And so they are forcing us to rethink what we mean by growth. They are forcing us in many ways to do what is impossible in our world, which is forcing us to share growth. And governments who are trained in the knowledge, my government, which is trained in the knowledge of the West, worry about limits, they worry about constraints. But I believe this is the opportunity that can lead us to a different tomorrow. The environmentalism of the poor tells us that the resource is limited. We need to tread lightly on earth. It tells us there is an alternative way. We can build economies that will benefit large numbers of people, that sustainably use the land, that share the water resources. That is the environmentalism of the poor. Now to do this, and this is the second course correction we need, we also need ideas and technologies for the future. The crisis today is that the technologies for environmental management have been developed by a world when it is rich. They are unaffordable for vast numbers of people, and they will not work. In my view, and that is the bottom line that I would like to put out to you, the fact is that if any approach is not affordable, if any technology for environmental management is not affordable, it cannot be sustainable. So affordability and equity are at the core of the challenge of sustainability. If we reframe the environmental issue saying that unless we have affordability, unless we have equity, we will not have sustainability, we will begin to move in the direction that you and I desperately want. And if we want to do this, we will have to look for answers in the ways of the past. We will have to look for it in the knowledge of the very poor, in what we call the unproductive systems, the systems that modern knowledge discounts. Today in India, cities are growing. But we are doing what the rest of the world has done when it comes to our water, when it comes to our waste. We are bringing water from vast distances. We are discharging our waste into taking it long distances. We do not have the money, we do not have the technology to be able to afford this. So we have huge challenges of pollution. But if we were to reinvent this so that we could actually look at the knowledge of the very poor, do rainwater harvesting at one level, use local water resources efficiently, optimize it, and use the most modern technology so that we would recycle and reuse every drop of wastewater. Do not create waste. Do not first create waste and then treat it. Treat waste as a resource to begin with. If we were to redo this, we would think about reinventing the flush toilet. We would not destroy the nitrogen cycle of the world. We would actually reinvent the way we did resource management. But we would do this learning that sustainability will not work if the answers are not affordable. And finally, to do this course correction, we will also have to look for answers in nature. We will have to understand the art, the science, and the strength of nature in the answers that it provides us. Today, human beings in our technology and in the answers that we have chosen, we use concentrated energy such as coal and oil, which has created enormous problems of local air pollution and global climate change. But if we understood the ways of nature, we would shift to weaker sources of energy like solar, or move to using rainfall as I just talked about. We would not wait for the rain to first get concentrated in rivers and aquifer. We would not look for energy to get first concentrated as coal to use it for our development. So the way, as I said, if we were to learn from nature, we would use energy in decentralized grids, not to give people one solar panel or another, but to build the world's smartest grid fueled by millions of mini or micro solar plants. This then becomes the new answer. We know we have to meet the needs of millions. We know we need development. We cannot meet the fundamental needs of healthcare, of water, of energy, of very large numbers of people. So the world needs growth. The question is, how can we have that growth so that it is equitous and so it is sustainable? We can do this if we reinvent. We can do this if we deepen democracy to keep listening to people. We can do this if we look for alternatives in technology. And most importantly, we can do this if we have the courage to think and be different in the world. Thank you very much.